Hello, everyone. I'm going to get us started. So good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Marian Bittler and I'm a professor of economics and the interim director of the Institute for Social Sciences here at UC Davis. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second ISS Distinguished Lecture. In October 2015, Professor Gary King of Harvard University delivered the inaugural lecture in this series, and we are fortunate to be welcoming an equally esteemed speaker this evening. The Department of Economics here at UC Davis is well known for its expertise in the field of international trade, and so it is particularly apt that our presenter, Assaf Razin, should specialize in that area. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped bring this event to fruition, including Vicki Austin, Jeremy Till, and Ben Hinshaw from the Institute for Social Sciences, Lori Odenwiller from the Department of Economics, and Katie Russ from the Department of Economics. And I'd also like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the California Israel Fund, Davis Faculty for Israel, the Jewish Studies Program, and the Levine Family Fund in Economics. And I'd like to advertise a few talks that are coming in the Levine Family Fund speaker series. Our next speaker is Ulrike Malmandiar from UC Berkeley, followed by Pascaline Dupas from Stanford, and Richard Blundell from UCL. Introducing Assaf Razin this evening will be Rob Veenstra, Professor of Economics and holder of the C. Brian Cameron Distinguished Chair in International Economics. Professor Veenstra is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the Division of Social Sciences, the Director of the Center for International Data, and of the International Trade and Investment Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, but really you're not here for me. We're here for Assaf Razin. To begin my introduction of Assaf, let me quote from a story of his life that was written and illustrated by his son Ronnie and his grandson Ido. They write, Assaf Razin's life story is one of extremes. It follows Assaf from the kibbutz Shamir in the Upper Galilee to the city of Tel Aviv, from Israel to different parts of the world, from his childhood in the nursery bed of socialism to the economics department at the University of Chicago, the cradle of intellectual capitalism. Our hero pursues a stellar career and personal achievements while withstanding rather dramatic personal events. As they write, Assaf received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1969, and he was on the faculty at Tel Aviv University from 1970 to 2008, including serving as Dean of the Faculty in Social Sciences and as Deputy Provost. Assaf also held a chaired position at Cornell University from 2001 until last year. During this time, he was active in discussions of economic policies in Israel through the Ministry of Finance and various public committees. He has published 19 books in the United States, dealing with topics such as international migration, foreign direct investment, public policy, and the welfare state. Earlier this month, Assaf was presented with the very distinguished Emmett Prize from the government of Israel. The selection committee for this prize writes that the Emmett Prize is awarded to Professor Razin for his pioneering and influential research in international economics, which has contributed to the understanding of a range of macroeconomic issues and which has impacted on the economic policies of countries and of international institutions. Now, on a more personal note, let me say that I first met Assaf almost 30 years ago. Just a few years after my wife and I arrived at Davis in 1986, I received an invitation to join a group of international economists at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was organized by Assaf and by his close colleague Elhanan Heltman. So my wife Gail and I spent a wonderful 6 months in Jerusalem in 1989. We can remember the date very easily because our son had his first birthday there. So it is very fitting that now, 30 years later, nearly 30 years later, Assaf would spend several months here at Davis. He has taught a course for our undergraduates. He has presented a research seminar on the topic of immigration. And now, this afternoon, he presents this public lecture on the topic of his latest book, As you can see the title here, Israel and the World Economy, the Power of Globalization. Please join me in recognizing and welcoming Assaf. So Assaf will be speaking for 45 minutes or a little longer, 45 minutes to an hour, but there will be time for questions at the end.
Thank you, Rob. And thanks also, Giovanni, the two that are responsible for me being here in this lovely place. And it's an opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, which is the Israeli economy, something that I've not been doing in terms of book writing for a long, long time. So the key words here is the power of globalization. And if you know the history of the Jews have been part of globalization since centuries or millennia ago. The Jewish dispersal, most of it involuntary, of course, across the world, forced on the Jews to establish global business and social connections. There were two Jewish traditions that contributed to this success. One is the halakha, and the other one is Beit Din. The halakha is the religious laws, goes all the way back 2,000 years ago. And the Beit Din is the rabbinic courts, also very, very old. And it was our colleague Avner Greif, who is now at Stanford, who wrote his first fascinating work on the Gniza, which was the storage of all the Jewish documents in Cairo, about the connection that is across Jews in the diaspora. And he stressed the fact that these two contributing facts, the religious law, the halakha, and the rabbinic courts, which were more than just in one location, produced the trust and enabled credit in earlier era that really underpinned the globalization of the Jewish activities. So, as you know, there are now anti-globalization sentiments rising in Europe and in the US. And the problem is that the increasingly integrated global economy that I studied in many, many ways in different places is blamed for the domestic economic distress. In this particular book, I argue that Israel, which had a remarkable development, offers a nice counterexample to this view. So what is globalization? It is the integration of markets in goods, in services, in capital, and also with people moving between different locations and nations. This process of globalization was accelerated in the 1990s with the fall of communism, the consolidation of the European single market, the growing openness of China and India, and as I said, it's currently under attack in Europe and the United States. So in Israel case, how should I put it back, Vicky? It's okay?
Yeah.
So in Israel case, the disintegration of the former communist bloc allowed full integration of many Jews who left the communist bloc and moved to Israel. The fall of Berlin Wall brought the unification of Germany, which was underpinned the European Union and the single market there. And this globalization process came to the pinnacle when both Russia and China became members of the World Trade Organization. So Israel's successful globalization is responsible, in my mind, to the economic success, and it was consistent, this globalization-based economic path was consistent with the enthusiasm with which policymakers around the world push forward globalization wave until a few years ago. Now, since we are very much part of the global arena, there were recently several unprecedented global episodes that impacted a lot on Israel. First, the Israeli immigration story. As I just mentioned, the collapse of the Soviet Union brought the massive wave of high-skilled immigration to Israel. There was the taming of inflation, which was a constant fight in Israel, which was enabled also by globalization and the fact that we built institutions which are consistent with the global policy making. Very recently, there was this global financial crisis starting in 2007 and 2008, but Israel showed robustness to the global crisis, which is an amazing feat. And Israel has pivoted itself towards Asia when China and India opened their gates to Israel, and China and India were embarking on these open door policies. And Israel, high-tech power, is obviously related to the global information technology surge, epicentered, of course, in California. And its spillovers were not unified across the world, but Israel was one of the benefactors. So just a short summary, Israel as a state was founded in 1948. And you remember that after World War II, the world economic order was reorganized in a globalization fashion, and Israel basically put itself right there on the wave. Globalized in trade, in terms of labor market, in terms of finance, and in 2010, Israel became a member of the OECD, which is the club of the rich countries in the world. But there are some things to be concerned about that maybe I will deal with at the end of the end of the lecture. There is a rising cost of West Bank occupation, direct and indirect, social and political. There is brain drain of top Israeli talents, which is assisted greatly by Israel's advanced higher education system and helped by the pro-skill bias immigration policies in Europe, Australia, and North America. And there was a steep rise in income inequality and social polarization. I'll start with the remarkable Israel's immigration story. Let me remind that we economists don't only treat migration and immigration as movement of labor from one place to another, although it's an important piece of it. There was the Swiss playwright Max Frisch that wrote, because he was in Switzerland and it's a place where there is a lot of immigration, he said poetically, "We ask for workers, but we got people." And from the economic point of view, the people part of it is the fact that it is interacting with the welfare state policies, it has fiscal consequences, and it is part of the political scene in terms of policy making. And as you know, immigration has significant fiscal implications. The key distinction is between high-wage migrants that are net contributors to the fiscal system because they pay progressive taxation and they get benefits which are uniform, but they paid in net more than they get from. Whereas low-skilled migrants are likely to be net recipients, net consumers of the welfare state because they pay a relatively smaller amount of taxes relative to what the benefits they'll get from the welfare state. And there are two important books in America that basically documented the fiscal consequences of immigration to America. First one was New Americans. Second one was Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration. And the second one of the persons that is sitting here, Giovanni, was a contributor too. Now, people may ask, why control migration? Why not have free migration? So here is a quote from Jeff Sachs. He says, if people were told that they could move, no question asked, probably 1 billion would shift around the planet within 5 years, with many coming to Europe and the US. No society would tolerate even a fraction of this billion. Any politician who says, let us be generous, without saying, we're not going to let the door wide open, will of course lose and will be replaced. So why Israel is an outlier to this thing of controlled migration? Because from the start, we have a semi-constitutional, although we don't have constitutions, a law of return from the first day of the state, 1948, which enables free immigration, but not only free immigration to the Jews, but also grant these immigrants immediate citizenship the minute they land from the sea or from the air, and also enable them to exercise voting rights just from the beginning. There is no other place in the world that has, from the economic, social, political point of view, this kind of situation where immigration, albeit only for the Jews, is free, uncontrolled. In Israel, which is the land of immigrants who came in waves, pushed around by different forces, it was always a situation where you have to absorb big chunk of migrants as a proportion of the population. Back in the 1920s, the wave of migrants amounted to 8.2% of the established population. In the early 50s, immediately after the state was born, they amounted in 2 years to 13%, 13.2% of the established population. And remarkably, in the 1990s, in a span of 11, 12 years, about 19% immigrants for the Soviet Union and the satellites countries, communist countries, came to Israel, 19% of the established population. And I would like to focus a little bit on immigration of the last wave from the former Soviet Union. And they were let go after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as you can see from this graph, they had several options. They could stay in the Soviet Union, which is now Russia and the republics that used to be under the Soviet Union. Or they can go to USA, or to Germany, or to other countries, and by default, if the other countries will not receive them, because all of the other countries have quotas, they are controlling their immigration, Israel was the safe haven. So there was a choice by these guys to do either one of the 4 or 5 options, and many of them came to Israel. What was important about this wave of immigrants, which was unique in terms of the Israeli history, is that they were basically with no many dependents. They come with a small size of the household relative to the size of the population, of the national average. They had better schooling. They had better academic degrees than the established population. And even in the first decades after they arrived, when they had to catch up with going up the economic ladder, they are still have better salary than the average, national average. And in terms of academic degrees, they are much above the Israeli national average. 41.1% of the families, the head of the family, had a bachelor degree relative to the national average, which was 29.5. But they also assimilated extremely well. By the way, I gave a talk in San Diego, and there they have the expert, Gordon Hansen, and he told me, which was right, that if you try to rank assimilation of immigrants across different countries, of course, the European come the last. The Anglo-Saxon world is a bit better, including the US, of course. But Israel is so much above. And one way to measure this assimilation is if the children outrank their parents in terms of economic performance. So in this particular figure, we look at the earning deciles, whether they are in the first deciles, poor, second deciles, less poor, until the 10th decile, which is the richest. So if the parents were in the first decile, the poorest decile, what will be the children position in the income distribution? And you can see in this graph that relative to the national average, the children of the former Soviet Union parents who were from the poor background, from the lowest decile, were very much prominent in the upper deciles. What? Oh, thank you. I could talk for ages, and you are so quiet until you came. So you see the graph now. And another way to do it is to measure the probability of outranking parents by their kids. And the FSU, former Soviet Union guys, outrank their parents in probability better than the national average, and in that particular figure also the Arab sector. I will come to the Arab sector at the end of the talk if I will not talk too much before. So one important thing that I noticed, and I put it in my research, is the fact that they had rights to vote, these guys, from the start, which is amazing. But usually, immigrants don't exercise these rights. So there is a political scientist here, Maoz, professor. So he knows Ariane and Shamir, who were studying, turnouts of different segments of the population. And they didn't find anything different than the other countries, that immigrants didn't really turn out in elections, except they found that these former Soviet Union guys had similar turnout than the established population. So they were very active politically. And I claim, although I will not be able to prove it, that they were responsible to reversal of policies in Israel because there were a huge number of them, they exercised their power, and in terms of economics, they made the welfare state less progressive, okay? But I will not have time to talk about it. I will just, in my model, I was trying to find out with the model who are the winners and losers from this wave of migrants that were basically triggered by exogenous shock, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the model tells me that who are the winners and the losers from this shock, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union, as far as immigration to Israel is concerned. So all native-borns, skilled and low-skilled, gained for various reasons that you have to look at the model. The only people that were crowded out were low-skilled immigrants. So they were the losers. But it is a remarkable situation where most of the population, all the native-born population, were gaining from this shock, political shock to the system. I'll skip the story of taming inflation, which is remarkable. I'll just say a few words that we are like a Latin American country in the 1980s. I can attest to it because I was the chief economic advisor to the government at the time. And we had a political revolution, which is called in Hebrew Ma'apach, and the opposition party, which is now called the Likud, took over after being 29 years in opposition. And they were very, very populistic at the time in terms of their economic policy, and that generated hyperinflation, and it took us 20 years to get rid of it. So the story I'm basically telling in my book is how this conquering triumph over hyperinflation took place, how we beat the populistic attitudes of then the government under the Likud. Basically, it was a national unity government that was basically able to take down on the inflation, but not quite. And it took 10 more years where we became more and more globalized, especially financially globalized, that helped us to move the whole thing down to the world level, the advanced countries level. But I'll skip that. I'll just show you the picture of this high inflation crisis around the end of the 1970s and the success of the stabilization policy in 1985, but which did not quite move it down completely. And then there was a lot of economic analysis that I had to do in order to tell you that the fact that we built, better institutions of macro policy, more independence of the central bank, everything that we imported from the rest of the world, including inflation targets, and very importantly, the trade effect, the pass-through from low inflation in the West into Israel that created this elimination of inflation. Let me just say that when I did it, I was reminded about my classmate, Rudy Dornbusch, because he wrote a lot about macro-populism in Latin America. And there were two phases of populism, macroeconomic populism. The first phase I should call sugar high phase, where, things look good. The economy is booming and so forth. But the second stage is a fiscal meltdown, financial meltdown, stock market meltdown, and very persistent recession. And the picture that in Israel that tells you about the two phases of macro-populism is here, but I don't have time to develop the story here. Then there was a remarkable, well, I already covered a little bit of the fact that the great moderation in the world, in the advanced countries world, help us to moderate our inflation, but I'll skip that here. And we stood the global depression of 2008, and I will also skip that a little bit. And I'll move into information technology. So here I'm talking like Rob Finstra, who is an expert on international trade, world expert. Innovation requires scale, and scale requires trade. An isolated small economy can never be a center for innovation. So this is why globalization is key to the emergence of high-tech industry, which is based on innovation, of course. Because to innovate, you have to think, what are the incentives to innovate? You innovate in order to generate valuable services, and to be valuable, this innovation should be resulting in repeated use of this knowledge on a large scale over time. One thing that was a bit little studied is the role of foreign direct investment, and more particularly the role of foreign venture capital in the emergence of the Israeli high-tech industry. Obviously, the incentive of the innovator is to, or the pecuniary incentives are to sell its product, to exit in the big market, but you need financing of that. The financing of such innovation is very risky, of course. And this was really the strengths of the Silicon Valley and of America, capitalism, that had this venture capital working like no other countries in the world. And the fact that Israel was a beneficiary of venture capital from abroad, which is a specific form of foreign direct investment, created an incentive for the Israelis to innovate, of course, because they were able to go through this dry, early period of not getting any income by this venture capitalist, and then be linked to selling the product in the world market, like only venture capitalists can do it for you. So the story of Israel is not only the human capital that is created in our universities and the fact that, we had the former Soviet Union immigrants coming with, some of them with high skill and their kids are better skilled. So all of that was very important to create the pool from which the high-tech sector started, but also the fact that we are financing it from venture capital that came from abroad. And you can see that Israel foreign direct investment is much above in recent times, during the time that the high-tech sector has emerged, than the average of developed countries. And part of it is this venture capital. And here is the foreign venture capital, how it was emerging at the same time that the high-tech sector was moving up. But it's also true that in a related way, the amount of spending on R&D, research and development in Israel, exceeds that of the OECD by much. Part of it is, of course, the army R&D that Israel is excelling, but part of it is civilian uses. So all this phenomenon put together were responsible for this takeoff of the high sector in Israel, which is a locomotive of the Israeli economy in many ways. So after telling these good things about what has been with the Israeli economy and society, and really unparalleled development, you just remember that in 1948, it was one of the low-income countries trying to absorb 15–20% of immigrants that came mostly from North Africa or from refugees from World War II, but they came with no skill. Many of them were dependent, old, and all of that. And we are isolated by hostility around us. So to think about the fact that we became a member of the OECD in 2010, and we are now doing better than countries like Portugal, for example, and we are competing with Ireland, which has a lot of common features to what happened in Israel. This is a remarkable story. And my point here is that the fact that we benefited remarkably from the new global order, economic global order that came out after World War II. Not many countries really put themselves into this wave of globalization. Israel did. But here is some issues that are trends, maybe negative trends for the future. In economics, we measure inequality, but by the so-called Gini coefficient. It's one measure. And if the number is high, it's more unequal. If the number is low, it's less unequal. But we distinguish between market-based Gini coefficient, what the market inequality comes out, and disposable income Gini coefficient. Because this is the bottom line. Disposable income is what matters. But it comes after the market is doing its job, and then redistribution by the welfare state is doing its job. So the difference between the two coefficients is a measure of redistribution. If there is small difference, it means that redistribution is small. If it is large difference, redistribution is large. First of all, how Israel is ranked across the world. This is a snapshot view in recent times. You can't really read everything, but you have to watch two things, I guess. One is that the first three bars, the top bars, are USA, UK, and Israel. The length of the bar is the disposable income inequality, but the bar is split between redistribution and market-based inequality. And you can see that Israel, in a snapshot of recent times, is bad in both fronts. And especially it's bad in terms of the gap between the two, which means that redistribution is lessened. And this is a view over time of what happened. Now, I will not be able to convince you, and it's a bit conjecture on my part and a bit of research on my part, but there was a turnaround of inequality following the former Soviet Union immigrant. So it's basically ended in a big way in the late 1990s. So you can see that there were many changes in the 2000s. So the first change is that the market-based inequality went down. And that's logically consistent with the view that these guys, the former Soviet Union guys, were skilled. And they moved into building a middle class in Israel. They are not rich because they didn't bring any capital with them. So that particular effect is to improve the market-based inequality, and you can see it there. But the second point is that if you look at the disposable income inequality, it has been growing following the wave of FSU immigrants. And the gap between them, which is a measure of redistribution, is becoming smaller and smaller. And I argue in my book that they were basically active guys in the political economy new equilibrium, which had a coalition of people of higher skill and income that tilted the welfare state towards more aggressive posture. So this is one concern. There was a declining market income inequality, which is more than offset by the fall in redistribution. Second point, which is remarkable and unique to Israel. Israel, among the OECD countries, almost 40 countries in this club, has by far the highest fertility rate. And this higher fertility rate, like in Gary Becker theory, a little bit, although I have different versions of it in my book, comes with relatively low skill acquisition. But it is centered among two segments of the population in Israel. The Arab sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector. Because they have higher population rate than the rest of the society, they are becoming a larger share of the economy. The good news, something that I will come back to, is that the Arab sector fertility rate is falling very significantly recently, and there is a remarkable integration of the Arab sector into the labor market and universities in Israel, and I will give you some figures about it. This is something that I've not seen in my life, such a remarkable situation where you go to Tel Aviv University and especially Arab women coming from Muslim background that didn't really traditionally permitted the girls to move out of the home. They are now entering the universities, even in economics. But in any case, that's the good news. The bad news is that the ultra-Orthodox guys are getting more numerous, and they don't show any tendency to lower fertility, and their skill acquisition, because of the unique situation of the ultra-Orthodox guys that are dependent on government subsidies, and the men in general don't go to work, they are basically staying at home, not at home, in the Torah places where you cannot really get any market skills. Basically, it's extremely bad news for this segment of the population that should have been contributing to Israel's society. They are segmenting away from it, and especially the labor market. And in my book, I also talk about a unique problem that creates this fertility, low skill acquisition among these ultra-Orthodox guys. That has to do with the fact that they are like a club where the social incentives, the peer group pressures, the wise men or the rabbis that you know inspires the peer group pressures is dominant relative to the private incentives. The parents would like their kids possibly to be successful, but social incentives will not permit it. And the whole club is putting walls so that it will preserve itself in some way. So this is sort of a socially, economically, a difficult issue to solve. Finally, Israeli Arabs, which is something that, again, let me just confess, I'm not young anymore. I was young when I saw Rob in Jerusalem in 1989. Not anymore. But I've seen two remarkable changes in my life. One that I will not dwell on is, what happens to the integration of women in universities and in the labor force. I'm not an expert on that, but I still remember that when I went to the University of Chicago, we were a class of 40, 50, depending, to what stage you count, because in Chicago at the time, after the first year, 30% of the students will have to drop out. But only two ladies were there. One of them is this lady from Harvard, Claudia Goldin, classmate of mine. But she was one of the two. Nowadays, it's 50-50 or more women. But I'll not dwell on that because this is a remarkable situation. But what happens in the last 3-4 years, in my eyes, to the integration of Israeli Arabs is remarkable. So, in the late 1980s, only 2,950 BAs were granted to Arabs out of 46,519. 25 years later, the picture is very different. The undergraduate student population at top university increased by 52%, and it reached almost 71,000 students. And the Arab students population increased by, listen to that, 296%. And you can bring more numbers. The Technion, which is typically hard sciences, which was a barrier to people in the Arab sector, now has more than 20% of its students from the Arab sector. So I'll just say, and also in the engineering colleges outside of the Technion, which is the prime, you have a lot of Arabs. So this is a phenomenon that it looks to be trending up, which is the good news about what's going on now in Israel. And I'll stop here.
Well, as I said, we have plenty of time for questions, so I'll just let Assaf field the question. And we have a microphone, just so the whole audience can hear your question.
So I suggest that if someone is courageous enough to ask a question, she or he should stand up, tell his name or her name, and ask the questions. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Joel Haas. You talked about the skill sets of the Israeli immigrants and how they contributed to the Israeli economy. How does that compare with the skill sets of the United States immigrants and how they contribute to the U.S. economy?
Well, it's extremely good question that I have not done a research on, so Giovanni can say more, because especially about scientific manpower that is now well represented from the immigration pools. So US is also a success story in terms of assimilation. In the US, in general, you can divide it into two phases. In the 19th century, all the way until World War I, the welfare state was minimal. Only Woodrow Wilson created the income tax, I guess, in 1912 or 13. And then there was the war, so you don't talk about immigration during the war. But the point is that there was no welfare state, and immigration was essentially free. So they benefited, of course. What you see in the US today has a lot to do with what happened in the 19th century and the early 20th century. There was a free migration. But then, of course, things started to be much more problematic in terms of immigration policies. They didn't like the Chinese to come, so they put a requirement on language. They also developed their welfare state, also in stages, started in a big way under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, Social Security, and many, many welfare state institutions. And then the next turning point was under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, Medicare, and so forth. And then all the way under Obama, the Obamacare, which was, again, a major welfare state institution that didn't exist before. But, and now the US is, of course, not as generous welfare state as Europe, but it's still, you know, a very important welfare state, and they restrict immigrants a lot. Not all the time according to merits. They include family reunions in order to bring, you know, more Europeans rather than bring Chinese or Vietnamese. So there are all sorts of Congress legislation that, you know, was making immigration policies a bit distortive in the eyes of an economist. But there is no question that the US is a land of immigration, but it's a different story. Israel always had free immigration of Jews. They had to receive them, even they come with no skill, old, sick, you name it. That was basically the 1950s. Luckily, in the 1990s, we got this influx of Jews from the Soviet Union, which gave, you know, a big push to Israel. But maybe it will be the next time it will be something else. I don't know. It depends very much on the push factor from abroad, not on Israel policies, because Israel is not restricting anything. Yes.
Ken Firestein. Going way back to the beginning of the talk, you suggested and asserted that it's a counter example for most of the current criticism of globalization. So my question is, in a country such as Portugal or Greece, or how might this look and play out if they were to follow some of the historical events and fortunes of how Israel progressed since '48? So the question is, how would it play out in another country in another situation?
For many reasons, they didn't have it. So basically have First of all, they didn't have democracy from the start. Israel, remarkably, was founded as a democracy. Second of all, they didn't have these links to the rest of the world that we had. We had less corruption, we had more democratic ways, we built our institutions. So it's very difficult to answer this question. Israel is standing out in terms of these things, and I don't know whether historically Portugal and Greece could have made it unless they were to have a different regime. If the European Union would have established itself, not in 1992, the Single Market Act, but say in the 1960s or 1950s, Greece institution would have been completely different. They will have a democracy, they will have a law and order, they have policies that make sense. But the integration of Europe was much more difficult. Anyway, it's just a speculation, but it has to do with different histories.
Tippi Goldcorn, I was intrigued by, well, maybe it is a small point, but it is a very important one now, the Gini difference. And you showed us that Israel is now number 3 in the section of USA and United Kingdom. And you said something that I was not sure, I'm not sure that I understood, and maybe you could explain it a little bit or enlarge it a little bit more. You said that, if I got it right, that there are some interests and groups that want to keep it this way. I'm talking about Israel. And I just wonder if you are ready to explain it a little bit further.
Well, in that regard, we are not different than any other country nowadays. The way the political system works itself. You see what happens now in the US in terms of standstill in legislation because they are very polarized and the system cannot really break this gridlock. In Israel, we have different politics, but still, in many ways, very harmful to growth and to innovation, if you like, or maybe not innovation, but to growth. I mean, I just told you about the ultra-Orthodox guys. So just the fact that because of our parliamentary system, they are always the pivot in the government, in the coalition. They extract these particular subsidies that they preserve their isolation from the rest of the economy. And you cannot really break the political system there easily, because in democracy and in parliamentary systems, like we have in Israel, this is how you get it. So the short answer is politics is very, very complicated. And in many ways, in recent times, it works against some of the economic progress and social progress in Israel. I didn't talk about Arab-Israeli relationship and all of that, which has also something to do with the deterioration of our politics. I don't think so, because the technology story came later, after we already tamed the inflation. So it played no important role. The important thing was to beat populism by the crisis that created the necessity of national unity government that spoke to different interest groups that were able to withstand, a big reform that made the hyperinflation move to about low two-digit. But then it was a very slow process where globalization was key, especially financial globalization, but also trade globalization, that allowed us to build institutions and to mimic the advanced countries' policymaking and institutions that allowed us to move inflation down all the way to zero. But technology, which was very important but was not part of the story. Yes? Well, it's a good question. It's something that I don't have ready-made answer, but let me give you 2 or 3 thoughts about it. The big push was the peace with Egypt in the 1980s. Even though we are under hyperinflation, we're allowed to move down defense expenditure because Egypt was our main rival, militarily speaking. And there was a remarkable shift down in defense. So first of all, we had to beat inflation, but then we started, growing and, putting something into high-tech industry and all that. But it's so much indirect ways. But if you just look at the main turning point in defense, which is the follow-up of the peace with Egypt, it contributed a lot to moderating inflation, creating better institutions of government, and moving also growth a little bit upward. And productivity started to pick up because of the technology boom in the late 1990s, but it was a bit 2 decades later. But there is no linear relationship between today's defense expenditure and growth. There is no, the cost of occupation, okay, which is something. It's very difficult to argue that it translates easily to lower economic growth. And part of the defense is, triggered some innovation. All the cyber innovation in Israel started in some elite units in the defense community. But it's a great question. I don't have ready-made answer. I don't think you can actually say that one causes growth or lesser growth. But I'm just seeing that the turning point in Israel was the peace treaty with Egypt under Sadat, and that created a situation where the defense went down from, say, 15% of GNP to 7% of GNP, and that started a new era in terms of taming inflation, creating better institutions of government, and finally growth.
Bob Rigler. In the US, it seems that a lot of the resistance to globalization has to do with the perceived dislocations domestically caused by, that are blamed on globalization. Does Israel have any examples to guide a big country like the US in this regard?
Well, first of all, with respect to the US, here we have Rob sitting, and he is now challenging a very publicized study by 3 authors. One was Otto, second was Dorn, and the third was Gordon Hansen. And they claimed that trade from China really created the Rust Belt in the Midwest and created a lot of difficulties in employment there and losing jobs. What Rob is showing that NAFTA and other trade agreements created also a boom for exports. So there were shifting of jobs because of trade. And in net, I don't know if the US gained or lost jobs. It's also depending on the time interval that you are talking about. So in general, in the long run, trade allows you to reshuffle resources, reshuffling labor from imports to exports, and doesn't have a direct effect, a net effect of job loss, but it has a positive effect on wages, okay? But everything, what I'm saying is subject to scrutiny and some different things. But, you know, it's a debatable point. In Israel, obviously, the wave of immigration in the 1950s was very bad for jobs. I mean, there were no manufacturing industry, there was nothing. So everything was related to creating new jobs. So the job and job and job was the main issue. Housing was the second issue. But when we talk about the last wave of immigration from the former Soviet Union, there was no apparent effect on jobs, on the number of jobs. Unemployment in Israel maybe went a little bit up in the beginning, but not very much. So the issue was different. Of course, some of the segments of our population were crowded out, but it was mostly first those Arabs that came from the territories that were driven out, because the Russian, when they came, they took any job available. But later on, I think because the economy was growing, I don't think the jobs was the main issue. Housing was a problem, but not jobs. Usually, in general, trade people like Rob and me and Giovanni and Ellen, Taylor, don't think that there is a direct long-term effect on jobs, on the number of jobs, of trade liberalization.
Dan Goldcourt. I know that there are no more prophets around, but are there any predictions as to the direction that the Israeli economy is heading? You know, we remember the days of the oranges and diamonds, now high tech. What next?
Well, we have a very thriving high-tech industry. We have great financial services that allow us to withstand the global depression in 2008. So we have a broad-based economy, obviously centered around the center of the country, and I am from Tel Aviv, which sometimes is regarded as a separate city, like California is a different state and separate state than the US. So it's very much like Tel Aviv and California in that regard play a similar role. So I have no predictions about the economy moving down, not in the foreseeable future. I might be wrong, of course. You remember that the Queen asked us economists, how come that no one of us saw the global depression coming? That was Queen Elizabeth's question. So all these predictions are with a grain of salt, but I have no reason to believe that the macroeconomy is faltering. I have a lot of concern about the periphery, about the inequality, and especially about the lack of integration of a growing share of the population of the ultra-Orthodox guys. And I have, of course, a lot of concern about whether we'll be able to reconcile our conflict with the Palestinians, because that really infiltrates into everything now, in politics, in undermining our democratic institutions, you name it. We have sort of Trump-like situation in many ways by the governing coalition in Israel. And mostly it is because of the fact that we are occupying these guys and we are not moving towards the reconciliation.
Haiti Russ, Economics. I noticed that you mentioned the important role of foreign direct investment in Israel's development story. I wonder if you have thoughts about any tax policies that might have been helpful in that respect, and if there are lessons there to be learned as the US considers its own tax reform.
It's a good question coming from Kadi. If you remember, she wrote a review article in the Journal of Economic Literature on one of my previous books with Ephraim Satka called Foreign Direct Investments. So she's the one that should ask this question. Actually, we have, as far as venture capitalists and this financing coming from abroad, we have a lot of tax incentives. I'm not sure that they are, on a cost-benefit analysis, are worth it or not, but the fact is that they are there. And also with respect to some other FDI flows. So in general, we are friendly towards foreign direct investment, not as friendly as Ireland. I asked Alan Taylor to write a paper with me. He will write it at some point about comparing the Irish experience to the Israeli experience. And the common thing is that foreign direct investment was flooding into Ireland because they were low tax, they were part of the European Union, so all these foreign direct investors would like to go to the European market, and the main gate was through Ireland. In Israel, for different reasons, we also had, as I just showed in the figure, a remarkable higher FDI than the OECD countries. We departed a little bit from Ireland in 2008. There were some of the first casualties of the Depression. And now they are trying to find out whether they can maintain some trade with the UK that is Brexiting. So they have some different problems nowadays. But in some ways, as far as the foreign direct investment, we are comparable to Ireland.
Is there a final question? Or shall we stop there? Let me thank the audience for all those questions and discussion, and thank Assaf very, very much.